Good Tuesday morning. Today's the feast of St. Luke the Evangelist. You know, I was just thinking of that. I more and more became a real fan of St. Luke. So honest to God, I mean that sincerely. First of all, he's the best of the four gospel writers, hands down. The guy was smart. The guy was a doctor. He did house calls. No, he didn't. Whatever. Anyway, Luke could write. He was a well-educated man, and he's also a Gentile. He is not a Jew. He's a Gentile. He's a disciple of St. Paul. So when you're reading Luke, what you're reading is a brilliant rendition of the preaching of the early church, but especially the preaching of St. Paul. And hence the preaching to the Gentiles. And daggone it, Paul, and he must have known, Luke must have known our Blessed Mother, because he tells the best story about her. Okay? If he didn't get it directly from her, can you imagine what the stories must have been like in the early church? Very early church, around 50 AD, 60 AD, around that time, when they're telling the story of the incarnation, the Annunciation, the Gabriel coming to the Blessed Mother, okay? Where would he get that from? He didn't know it. He wasn't around, okay? He would have gotten it, and he wouldn't have got it from St. Paul. I don't think Paul would have had a clue to that stuff. Paul's encounter with Christ comes later. That is, he's not part of the early story. He is the gospel. Let me put it this way. St. Paul, I don't think, would have been privy to that early narrative of the incarnation, of the Annunciation, okay? He begins with the crucified, resurrected Christ on the road to Damascus, and he unpacks that. That's his genius. Luke gets that story from someone else. He couldn't have been there. He wouldn't have known it? But he would have got it either from the early apostles, or he would have got it right from Mary. My guess, he got it from our Blessed Mother. She says, this is how it happened. And the guy could write. Well, what I think is so fascinating and so wonderful about Luke, he's a Gentile like the rest of us. And he learns about Christ from our Blessed Mother, who is the church, and the apostles, and especially St. Paul. From the preaching and the loving preaching and narrative of the church, the sharing of the church's vision of who and what is Christ. That's where he comes from. And then he is the great preacher of it. He himself becomes the great narrator of the great story. You see, he learned from the church, Mary and the apostles. He had to, especially St. Paul. Probably the combination of Paul and Mary, okay? But then he becomes the author and the narrator. And he tells some of the most beautiful stories about Christ and his Blessed Mother, our Blessed Mother. You see? It's neat, isn't it? It's neat. Luke is us. He's the Gentile who comes to the faith through the preaching of the church. And then he becomes a preacher of the church. Maybe it's best writer. Arguably, he gives us the Acts of the Apostles, isn't it? He's the author of the Acts of the Apostles. He tells the story of the early church. He's a good writer. He was writing about what he knew, which was the early church. Her reflections, her memories, her actions, the acts of the apostles. You see? And he hands it on to us. And the church, in her authoritative preaching, as successors of the apostles, from pope to bishops to clergy, to all the people who are, as it were, by baptism, apostles of the church, passing on from generation to generation the great story of who and what is Christ, who and what we are in Christ, through Christ. Okay? We pass it on to our children. I pass it on to the parishes. One of the great privileges of my life is right here where I'm sitting at St. Mark's, formerly St. Tim's. 51 years I've been here. That's 4 generations, by my count, 4 generations, maybe even 5 if you take the old timers who founded these parishes. I knew those men and women. I ministered to those men and buried them in many instances. They were old when I came here. When I was 30, they were 70 and 80, okay? And then their grandchildren, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, many generations. I counted 5, actually, if you take the founders all the way now to the babies that I baptized the other day, you see? What a privilege it is for a guy like me, because I wasn't ordained to be a parish priest. I'm not. I'm a college teacher. I'm not a very good, well, I hope I'm decent. The kids say I'm okay, all right? And I wish I could say I was a great writer. I ain't no St. Luke or St. I'm not a great writer. I'm just tolerable, okay? But I hope I'm an effective teacher, and I hope I'm an effective preacher. I've been here I came here just to get a roof over my head, and I've stayed 51 years. Even when I was in Louisville, I used to come back and forth to visit my friends, but to visit my friends was to be a part of the parish. I never lost it. And then one time when there was a significant crisis here, transition of priests, etc., was just disabled. I remember the bishop asked me, by way of the chancellor, if I could cover the parish during Easter, and I did. He needed somebody who could come in, and it was just unstable. It was just an unstable time in the life of the parish. St. Tim's, okay? That's a long time ago, 35 years ago, more. So I've been a part of this. I've been a part of her story, just like Luke became a part of the story of the early church, privy to its memories, privy to its narrative, privy to the people who founded it. See? Passed it on. Well, I pass on the story of St. Tim's and St. Mark's, especially Timmy's. I pass it on to the 5th generation. You see? I'm an instrument. Not an author, but an instrument of the people of the parish, the narrative, their apostolic role in baptizing and raising their children, the first communion, the conference, all of that, and the burials. The beginning is the end. I remember Luke Camario, God rest him. Lou said to me one time, but the clergy, but me, but the priest, he says, you baptize us, you marry us, and you bury us. And he was right. We do those things. And I've been privileged to be in one place that many years that I have baptized, and I have given communion to, and I'm married and buried. Some of the very people I married, I performed their weddings. I believe I've even buried some whom I have baptized. And something in a 35-year period, more than that, in a 50-year period. Yeah, that's the truth. I feel with St. Luke. I like St. Luke a great deal. First of all, he's a great writer. Now, I appreciate good writing because I'm no good at it. I love good writing. I like Junie, my friend Junie. She loved good writing. She taught me how to read, actually. We used to read books together. She didn't like the way I read. She said I was no good at it. So she'd read to me. We read 80 books together. And that's something. What a wonderful story of life. Junie died 12 years ago. Yeah. Many of the generation I love the most are gone. But the grandchildren are here, their children and their grandchildren. And so we pass on the story. That's life. And Luke is an example of it. He learned from those who went before, and then he became the voice of those who would follow. He handed on the great story. And he gave us our Blessed Mother. The story of our Blessed Mother comes from Luke. He could tell a story. And the rest of us have been enriched forevermore by the great storyteller, St. Luke. I hope, in a very diminished form, I am also a Luke, a Gentile in this parish, an outsider who became an insider and passes on the story of the parish, the story of the people, our story.